This is off of a website that I found that says that you can read it for yourself. 333 people were seen in emergency rooms, this is in the United States, for suicidality related to methylphenidate use, and 388 were seen for suicidality related to amphetamine, dextroamphetamine, like Adderall use. And that's from the Narconon website. So I'm sure the epidemiologists in the crowd immediately see the problems in abstracting much from this sort of information to a broader issue of stimulant medication and suicide. But we looked at this systematically, or rather this morning I looked at it systematically using our own data from our own studies to just illustrate the point. So at Sick Kids, if you are referred for an assessment of ADHD, many kids are over the years, and we've systematically collected information. Now that information is part of POND, so that it can be mined across disorders, etc. But as part of that, we ask a number of questions about mood, and the kids have an extensive assessment where the team, which includes a psychiatrist, psychologist, a speech-language pathologist, et cetera, makes a diagnosis of whether the child has ADHD or not ADHD, because they might have other kinds of disorders even though they're referred as having ADHD, whether they have a major depressive disorder. This is kind of like what you see in depressed adults, you know, a prolonged period of many, many months of depressed mood, etc. And I'll show you how often that happens. And then also a condition that's, you might call it like depression light, which is sort of officially known as dysthymia or something. It goes by a number of different names, but it's more a question of low mood, irritability that waxes and wanes, and it isn't quite like a depression that you see in adults. And as part of these assessments, we ask kids these kinds of questions. And I'm going to talk about the answers to this particular question. So as part of the child interview, they're asked about suicide. Do they ever think about killing themselves? And you'll see most kids say they don't think about it. And you'll see that most kids say they have thought about it, but they wouldn't do it. And you'll see that very few kids in these assessments say that they think about it and they have a feeling that they might want to do it. So I would never try to show you these kinds of slides as part of a proper talk, but I wanted to do this for a number of reasons. One is, you'll see down in the bottom right-hand corner of the top of those three slides, 1391, 1,391 kids. So that is the total number of kids that we have in this database. And I hope you'll see, in a way, this is an illustration of the power of large-scale data and being able to quickly mine it, which is what the Ontario Brain Institute helps the POND network do and supports us cross disorders to be able to have ready access to this kind of data. This particular data set comes from the previously funded studies in my lab. So I could go on this morning and access data on 1,300 kids to answer the questions that the parent asked. So the first slide shows how often people, what the answers were to those questions, whether they think about it, whether they think about it, what wouldn't do it, or whether they would like to kill themselves. So you can see that that 31, and on the left-hand side, you can see this is organized by age. So kids under 10 years of age, who we saw 884, because that's generally the peak age of referral for ADHD, the 31 actually of those 884 kids thought about committing suicide, harming themselves. And under 10, only one of the kids 10 to 14, so the rate's actually, if anything, dropping drastically, and none of the kids over 14 said that they wanted to kill themselves. So this means either older kids are very good at not telling you what's really on their minds, which is one possibility, or that younger kids don't really altogether understand what you're asking them when you ask them these kinds of questions, which is also another possibility. We asked we looked at the relationship between whether or not the kids were on medication and how they answered these questions. So you could see that 2.3, where it says blank, I put in the percentage. So 26 kids who were unmedicated out of 1,130, that's 2.3%, said that they thought about suicide and wanted to kill themselves. And that's exactly the same proportion as you find in kids who are taking medication. So medicated kids are no more likely to answer that question that way. What if you break it down by depression? That's the third table. You can see that first thing is that you see that, and this is an important take-home message, that depression, major depression, this is like depression of the type that you see really in adults. So this is pretty heavy duty and quite serious and would have required action on the part of the team that was doing the assessment, is found in about 2.5% of kids that we see. But it was actually no more frequent in the kids with ADHD who received an ADHD diagnosis than it is in the kids who came but didn't receive the diagnosis of ADHD. So we're breaking this down step by step. So, and I'll tell you the take-home message of that. Then we asked about, then of course we looked at the diagnosis of dysthymia, which is this kind of more persistent and, as you can see, more frequent pattern of irritability and moodiness, et cetera, over a prolonged period of time. And that's certainly more frequent, but it's still only about 3% of the ADHD group, and you find it in about 3% of kids who don't have an ADHD diagnosis. So neither major depression nor dysthymia is particularly frequent in this ADHD group of kids. Then if you look at the link between major depression, ADHD, and thinking about suicide, you can see that the ADHD kids are who have depression, which is this group. There are only 24 of them. You find that only about half of you find in half of the ADHD kids with major depression think about killing themselves. That makes, as it were, sense if from a diagnostic point of view. But that's hardly more frequent than you find in non-ADHD kids. So essentially, what you have is the following. ADHD kids do think about suicide. They rarely get to the point where they are thinking about killing themselves or having a plan to kill themselves. And we know that while suicide in young children, especially in puberty, is a serious issue, it is still a low frequency behavior. Major depression and dysthymia are rare in an ADHD group of kids, but it does occur, and it needs to be assessed and identified. It doesn't put neither ADHD nor stimulant medication nor ADHD plus depression is a particularly strong risk for thinking about suicide. But in your assessments, when you encounter your physician, you should be discussing the issue of stimulant medication and all adverse effects, not just this adverse effect, with your physician. And if you have any concern about your child and whether or not your child has dysthymia or major depression or is suicidal, by all means, talk to your family doctor or whoever is managing your care. That's question number one. Family and environment in relationship to ADHD. Let me break it down this way. So ADHD has been, more than any other child mental health disorder, has been subject to twin studies. So twin studies, probably are capitalize on a natural experiment. So they're, let's say, two kinds of twins. They're identical or monozygotic twins, or fraternal non-identical twins. And the identical twins share 100% of their genes, and non-identical twins, 50% on average. So if you compare how much alike monozygotic and dizygotic twins are, you can start to get a picture of whether or not genetic and non-genetic factors are accounting for that particular trait. And you'll often hear, when people give talks about autism or OCD or ADHD, they'll start by saying it's a highly heritable trait. What they're usually talking about are the results of twin studies, where monozygotic twins, who are 100% alike genetically, are more likely to be alike than dizygotic twins. Using that kind of analysis, you can actually figure out what is not genetic about a trait. So ADHD is a highly heritable trait, like autism and less so OCD, for example. And the bulk of the risk factors for a condition like ADHD that are not genetic or heritable are environmental. And these twin studies can break down the environmental component of the risk into two major dimensions. One is those kinds of environmental factors that make the kids similar and those that make them more unique. What makes kids similar? Well, that would tend to be family-wide factors, community-wide factors, things that are shared by everybody in a family, or those twins in particular. And non-unique factors would be environmental exposures, for example, that affect one child more than another. And that would tend to make them less alike, right? So these are factors that usually one twin would experience and not both. And that could be toxins, that could be trauma, that could be unique kinds of parent-child interactions, because we know we don't treat all kids in exactly the same way, even if they're identical, more or less, because they're twins. So what you find in ADHD twin studies is the environmental risks tend to be non-shared, meaning that the environmental exposures that are we think that the environmental exposures that are contributing to ADHD are largely those that are affecting one kid and making them dissimilar from their sib. So what are those possibilities? It could be some exposure to things that would make you the same would be anything that, let's say, was a maternal exposure in utero. So smoking or drinking. So we know that we know that exposure during fetal development to alcohol can have a range of effects, but that would affect both kids simultaneously. Trauma after birth would probably affect kids differently. So so there are many possibilities. Toxic exposures as well could affect individuals separately. So what about environmental protection and remediation, or the protection and remediation targeting environmental risks? Well, there are a couple that I want to mention, because when I'm not studying ADHD or working in Pond, I study kids with traumatic brain injury, and I can tell you that that children with ADHD are vastly overrepresented in samples of kids who have burns or have suffered head injury. So if ADHD exists at 5% of the general population, you'll find that in a typical sample of kids with head injury, 20% of the kids had a pre-existing diagnosis or pattern of ADHD. And the same is true in burn samples. So what's the environmental protection that this speaks to? Well, I'm saying helmets. That's obvious. So I can refer you to this month's Consumer Report, which has a great review of bicycle helmets. So if your kid has a diagnosis of ADHD, they shall not ride a bike without a bicycle helmet. They also need to, and parents need to learn, and family doctors need to talk to their families about the following: the fact that these kids are at increased risk throughout life, starting in the preschool years, to increased risk of burns and trauma. And so this needs to be discussed frankly with parents in the doctor's office, and then it needs to be discussed with your kids in order to keep them safe. So that's one. I'm on a bit of a bandwagon about of that right now. or no, podium, maybe not bandwagon, whatever. So, and the last thing I want to say is that parent training because this was a specific question, parent training for kids with ADHD, for the families of kids with ADHD, is an evidence-based treatment. And it is part of any overall comprehensive treatment plan for kids with this particular diagnosis, but I think you'll find that that's probably true across the full spectrum of mental illnesses amongst kids, or mental health problems amongst kids. So I'll stop there. I don't know whether there's time for a supplementary. Anybody who had asked these questions or whatever might want to follow up?
At what age, well, you said under 10, what age do you start the assessment at?
What could you?
Sorry, you said there was the chart that said kids under the age of 10. What's the earliest you would start an assessment of like?
What's the earliest I would ask a child if they ever think about?
Like what? Yeah, what age is the?
That's a very good question. You know, I think it's based on the individual characteristics of the child. I guess let me rephrase or repeat the question. I think the question is how. To make it a really tough question, I would ask it this way: how young would you,
right.
young a child would you ask about? Do they think about killing themselves?
Right.
So we don't ask like that. We're having a conversation with the children, and we say, we ask them about their mood, and we ask them about, if they get down, what do they think about, and stuff like that. So we're very careful about that. Because if you just ask a question straight out, it can be difficult to get a valid answer. And then we're coding the answers that we get from them. But I would say that, that it's rare for us to be talking to kids about, it's common for us to talk to kids about mood, but to use the word suicide in a child under 10 is not, it probably doesn't happen at all. It's more about them talking about, life's not worth living. They have black thoughts. We ask them what they mean, that sort of thing.
I guess I didn't ask the question correctly. What's the age that you start these conversations at? Like when would you, what age would you assess these kids? Like what's the youngest age you assess them? What words you use, it doesn't matter to me. Like if a child was showing signs of those kind of thoughts at a young age, what's the youngest you would start seeing them? To do that kind of assessment to see if there's an issue.
Well, you see, you do see depressed children. I mean, they, of essentially almost all ages. It's a matter of debate about how you diagnose or when you consider a very young child to be depressed, but it's not uncommon to encounter 5, 6, 7-year-olds who talk about how demoralized they feel, how upset they feel about a range of different things, how they don't want to go on, they have no energy or motivation to pursue even activities that normally they're interested in. And sometimes kids like that will actually talk about, in their own way, about life's not worth living. It sounds awful, but it does. I mean, it's dreadful just to express it, but it does happen. So if I'm a parent and I have a young child and I feel that that's the situation, I would engage in a conversation with them at almost any age. I wouldn't say, do you think about killing yourself? But I would say, I would talk to them about their mood. Is that getting at what you're asking?
Yeah, so what age would you say they have to be assessed? They should be assessed if they're making some comments like that. What's the youngest age?
At what age should they be assessed? If you ever had a concern that your child was down in the dumps and depressed or something like that, I think that the answer is at any age. You might not be right. You might be like I am, a worried parent, and you never stop worrying even when they get older. But the worst that can happen is it comes up in a conversation with the family doctor or with the pediatrician, and if you feel you've had a good response from that doctor, then I might leave it there. But it's not uncommon for kids of that age to get referred for assessments. Rarely specifically for mood disorders, but it does happen. Like, it's not so common that you get a referral through the clinic that says, please assess this 5-year-old, we think he or she's depressed. But we get all sorts of other things, badly behaved, learning problems, ADHD, anxious, because you can see that depressed.
Autism as well, or not so much?
Depression can occur in kids with autism, and depression is covered in quality assessments, as an issue, is covered in quality assessments of kids with autism, intellectual deficiency, etc. We refer to this as comorbidity. People have said associated mental health concerns. Sometimes it's those problems rather than the quote-unquote primary diagnosis that requires more effort and attention and care.
Thank you.
I'm going to give you the chance because I know you've got the questions, so please come up to the mic.
Thank you. This is with respect to the higher incidence of head trauma and burns with regards to ADHD children. What would be the etiology of that? Is it lack of awareness of their environment, their social cues? Like, how is that explained? And then if you had time later on in the evening in terms of parent training would be helpful as well.
That's a great question, because when I say what I said is the typical mental illness. So did everybody hear the question? So what's the in a way, what's the mechanism of the increased likelihood that a ADHD kid will have a traumatic brain injury, a head injury? And the immediate impression you get is of a kid like running across the road without thinking, or like I had once, a kid trying to jump from one garage roof to the next garage roof. It was amazing. It's not that simple, because not all kids who come in with a traumatic brain injury were, as it were, responsible for their head injury, if you will, in that way. Like, they're not all riding, bike riding is the most common mechanism of traumatic brain injury in kids. So it falls in sports and stuff like that, but also motor vehicle accidents. And they're obviously not driving the cars. And sometimes a parent is driving the car, but not always. So I think that when you're talking to parents of ADHD kids, as you know, these are conditions that run in families. So and very common for us to end up in a conversation with parents about their own ADHD. And I think at that point you also talk about risk-taking and safety planning and stuff like that.